everyone, and welcome to this presentation on the Structural Racism Framework. The citation for the information in this presentation is below from your reading. This video is the introduction, making up part 1 of the series for our class in terms of weeks 4 and 5. Let's start by defining what we mean by structural racism within this framework in terms of what this framework is. So this framework allowed us to have a new language for understanding both advantages and disadvantages in current society. And when I say new, it's not new anymore really, but at the time, it really helped us to understand the difference between structural racism and institutional racism. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but conceptually they are different. The importance of the language surrounding institutional racism really was about taking us from understanding that racism isn't just at the individual level in terms of individual actions. Racism exists in the practices and the procedures and the policies within institutions. So when I say institution, I mean really systems like the education system, the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, etc. All those systems that I reviewed in the critical race theory video on embedded racism. So institutional racism was a way for us to understand how racism is embedded in the structures of society, but within any given institution. Structural racism took us from understanding single intra-institutional settings to understanding how inter-institutional arrangements and interactions work in order to create this web of structural racism. In other words, the structural racism framework allows us to understand the ways in which the following interact, creating advantages and disadvantages for different groups over time. Yes, this is key. So the idea with the framework is that all of these interactions have taken place over many, many years, and that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to change. So what are these things that are interacting? Well, we have historical legacies, we have previous and current public policies, we have those institutional practices, and we have popular representations and stereotypes, etc., of different groups. The structural racism framework and critical race theory really go hand in hand, and in fact, there's overlap there. So both are concerned with how expressions of racism have evolved over time. For example, the overt racism of the 60s gave way to subtler, more racialized patterns that were in the form of covert racism. Now, of course, with the Trump administration, there's a rise in more overt racism, but the covert racism still exists. Both CRT and the structural racism framework incorporate this idea into their concept of embedded racism. For critical race theory, it's trying to understand how these dynamics work to maintain the existing racial hierarchy, even as they adapt with the times or accommodate new racial and ethnic groups. Critical race theory also incorporates this in part of, just said that. I meant the structural racism framework also incorporates this idea because both are concerned with understanding how society organizes itself along racial hierarchies in order to then create the disparities that we see. Okay, so here is the structural racism framework. This figure is from your reading, and as you can see, there's different parts of the framework, and we'll go over each one individually in individual videos, but for now, let me just give you an overview. When we are discussing white privilege within the context of the dominant consensus on race, what we really mean is historically accumulated white privilege, not just current advantage, but how that advantage has accumulated over time. In terms of national values, these are things like equal opportunity, personal responsibility, the idea of meritocracy, and how these values are supposed to be race neutral, but they actually have embedded within them a lot of racialized ideas. When it comes to contemporary culture, this involves all the norms of society, including stereotypes, as perpetuated by media. And I don't mean just like news media, but magazines, movies, etc. But basically the idea being that the contemporary culture provides a lens through which people are seen, and then how people are seen determines public policy for them. In terms of current manifestations, we're going to discuss processes that maintain racial hierarchies. These are marginalization, exclusion, exploitation, and sorting. When it comes to racialized policies and institutional practices, those are the embedded racism pieces that I was talking about in the critical race theory video. So all of those disparities in systems like the criminal justice system, the public child welfare system, the education system, housing, etc. And then all of these lead to racial disparities, such as inequalities in current levels of well-being. And here we're talking about health, mental health, wealth, etc. And also undermining the capacity for upward mobility. And when we take all of this together, that explains why we have all of these ongoing racial inequalities. And that's the end of the introduction. As I mentioned at the beginning, each part of the framework has its own separate video, so make sure to watch each of those. Thank you for watching. Bye.